Hey, once again, we want to welcome you to Livewire Church. It is great to have you here today. Great to have you here. Is everybody doing good? Everybody doing well? You out there? All right, just checking, just testing. Just want to make sure we got a crowd. You know, these lights get pretty bright, and sometimes I can't see you guys. So just want to make sure you're out there. You're probably wondering why I'm holding this kind of wadded up, what looks like poster. We're kicking off a new series called Blueprints. And actually, these are the blueprints to our very own place, our very own facility. These are our blueprints. But I just thought I'd bring them. It was fitting, even though we didn't plan this in any way, it was fitting as we kicked off our new series called Blueprints. I thought it was fitting that we have our own blueprints for our own place that we've been looking at quite often. We've been, and if you'd like to look at them afterwards, you're more than welcome to. But we've been looking at them quite often, kind of thinking about the space and how we're going to organize stuff, where we're going to put things. And so I'll give you some more information on the building in just a few moments or when we close today. But we're kicking off this series, Blueprints. If you know anything about blueprints, anybody ever look at a blueprint? I mean, those of you that are in any particular trade, you've probably seen blueprints. Now, the thing about blueprints, because you look at these and you're like, well, you know, that looks white to me. But the thing is, when they were originally invented, it was on some special paper that was actually blue, and it would have a white outline of whether it was a building, whether it was an automobile, or whether it was some type of a structure. But there's a blueprint for anything that is being built. And I think it was back in the 19th century when blueprints were actually invented, and they were actually blue paper with white outlines of the structure, again, the house, the automobile, whatever it might be. But everything has blueprints. Anything that's being constructed, those of you that are in any type of a trade, if you're an electrician, if you're a plumber, if you're an AC guy, if you're a general contractor, if you're a framer or architect, or I can't think of the engineer, that's another one, but you've looked at blueprints over and over. You've seen blueprints, and you look at them over and over. I used to be an electrician before I got into the ministry. I was an electrician full time, and I tell my wife all the time, if I wasn't called to the ministry, if I wasn't a pastor, I would have my own electrical business. I would have had that, would have gotten my license and had my own business. And I looked at prints all the time, especially being an electrician and looking at where lights are placed, and there's one thing where when you look at blueprints and you see where they want a light, or where they want an outlet, or where they want a fan, it's one thing to see it on the blueprint, but once that house gets framed, then some other things, the framing also dictate where that fan can go, because sometimes there may be something that can't be moved. You know, it may be a truss or a header or something that can't be moved, and you just kind of got to work around it. But I'm very familiar with blueprints, and there are many of you that are here that are familiar with blueprints. And again, the thing about blueprints, it's an outline. It's a plan of action that reveals how a house is going to be built. It's the plan of action that demonstrates and that shows how a particular building, a structure, if it's an automobile, how that structure, how that automobile is going to be built. It goes by a certain plan. There's a certain blueprint. Now, here's the thing about all of that, is because just like there are blueprints for houses, there are blueprints for automobiles, there are blueprints for any type of structure, there's also blueprints for life. And there's also a blueprint for your personal life and for my personal life. And I wonder who might be the architect, because there's always an architect. Whenever you want to design a home, it's one thing. Like for me, I'm not an architect, and I don't know anything about blueprints. I don't know anything about, as far as, formulating blueprints. I don't know anything about that stuff. I have to go to an architect. I've got to go to an engineer. I got to go to somebody that could draw up the blueprints. So if it's with our own place, if it's a house, whatever, I've got to go to somebody that knows that stuff, that could put my ideas onto paper. And so with every blueprint, there's always a designer. There's always an architect. There's always somebody that is drawing up those blueprints. And there is a designer, there is the architect, that is also the one that drew up the blueprints to life, and more specifically, the blueprints to your personal life and to my personal life. And so we're going to kick off this series. It's going to be a 3-week series. We're going to introduce it this morning, then we'll continue on the next couple of weeks. But Jeremiah was a prophet of God, and a prophet was simply somebody that foretold events that God would use to tell of future events, and God would use, or God would tell that to a specific individual, or God would tell that to a whole nation. God would use that prophet to speak about future events with an individual or the whole nation. Well, God is giving some words to this guy, Jeremiah. Back in the Old Testament, God's giving these words to this guy, Jeremiah, and he begins to kind of share some things that also relates to us, that also relates to you and I. We pick this up in Jeremiah 29:11, and here's what God's telling Jeremiah. He says, I know the plans that I have for you. Now, God is not just speaking to Jeremiah here, he's actually speaking to the nation of Israel, and he's speaking to his people, and so this relates again to us as well. He says, I know the plans that I have for you, declares the Lord. They are plans for peace and not disaster, plans to give you a future filled with hope. Did you notice that God says, I know the plans, blueprint? God says, I've got the outline. God says, I know exactly what I'm doing. In other words, God is the architect of your life blueprints. God's the one that's behind it all. God's the one that designed it all. God's the one that created life. He is the one that thought it all up. It was his idea. And the great thing about God is, unlike me, where if I have this idea and if I want to construct something, I've got to go to an architect so that they could put it down on paper so that we can see how it all comes together. Unlike me, God is both the creator and he's the architect. He's the one that designed it and he's the one that creates it. He's the one that not only created this earth, but he's also the one that created your very life. He's the one that thought up your life. See, your life has a blueprint to it. And this is what we want to dive into a little bit, because there's also other aspects of blueprints that we can follow. But God's saying, hey, I'm the designer. I know the plans that I have for you. I know what I drew up. God says, I laid out the blueprint and it was blank. And then I started drawing out your life. And I started putting it down. I started outlining. I started putting together this plan of action that I have for your life. See, God is the designer. God is the one that created your life blueprints. In fact, going back to the creation of the world, in the New Testament, Paul writes this in Ephesians chapter 1, verse 4. He says, before the creation of the world, he chose us through Christ to be holy and perfect in his presence. He said, before the creation, before I even created anything. And here's the other thing is, notice he says he chose us through Christ to be holy and perfect. He chose us through Christ. And I mean, it takes a fool. It takes, somebody that's just really just stupid to kind of deny that there is evil in our world. To deny that there is wickedness in our world. There is absolutely, we know that, right? It doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure that out. We know that there's evil in the world. We know that there's wickedness, there's perversity, there's just all kinds of chaos. And so notice that God says this. He says, before the creation of the world, Paul writes, God chose us through Christ. Why? God provided a way. Instead of, this is amazing. Because when Adam and Eve messed it up for humanity, and we'll talk more about that next week, but when Adam and Eve messed it up for humanity, God didn't say, oh, you know what, scratch that, scratch humanity, I'm just going to start all over. You know what, I designed something and they messed it up, I don't like it, we're just going to... God didn't do that. In fact, it was never in God's plan to start over. It was never in God's plan to get rid of humanity. It was never in God's plan because mankind messed it up to say, forget it, I'm over it. We're just gonna do something new. That was never in God's plan. Now, yeah, God knew about Adam and Eve and that they were gonna mess it up, and God had already made provision. And so here's what Paul's writing here. He says, before the creation of the world, he already chose you through Christ. He already made provision for every single one of us. He already made a decision that he was going to provide a sacrifice, that he was going to provide a way where there was no way, so that you and I could still be saved, so that you and I can still have that relationship and that connection with God. But here is the interesting thing again, before the creation of the world, right? So in other words, before God drew up the foundation of the earth, before he even created that, he drew up the blueprints of your life. That's an amazing thought. When you go to the creation story back in Genesis and you see everything, God said, God said, God said, and it was, and it was, and it was. Everything that God said, it was, it became. Well, before he even said anything, he drew up the blueprints of your life. You were already on God's mind before anything else. You were already on God's thoughts before anything else. And speaking of thoughts, when you go back to Jeremiah 29:11, again, he says, I know the plans that I have for you. That word plans, some of your older translations, like a King James version of the translation of the Bible, has the word thoughts in there. In other words, God's saying, I know the thoughts that I have for you, declares the Lord. They are thoughts for peace and not disaster, thoughts to give you a future filled with hope. And it kind of got me thinking like, okay, well, God is the designer, and before God created anything, God said, I'm gonna design your life. I'm gonna lay out the blueprints, and I'm gonna outline your life, the things that I have for you, the things that I want you to do, I want you to accomplish, what I want to make up of your life. It kind of got me thinking like before, or when God was kind of going through that process, and then God even knowing that, okay, we're gonna mess it up as far as mankind goes, and if we're honest, again, we mess it up every single day, but yet God still said, I chose you through Christ. But it got me thinking, like, what does God think about me? Like, what does God think about you? Like, what does God think about us? What's actually going through his mind when God thinks about us? Well, David actually answers this question in Psalm 139. King David, all right? King David writes this. He says, in verse 17, how precious are your thoughts concerning me? My precious. Not that one, but you get the idea. But he says, how precious or how wonderful, how awesome are your thoughts concerning me? So David is talking to God and he's saying, God, how awesome, how precious, how wonderful are your thoughts concerning me, oh God. How vast in number they are. If I try to count them, notice this, David says, they are numerous. I can't even count them. If I try to count them, there would be more of them than there are grains of sand. David says there would be so much more thoughts that you have about me than there are grains of sand. Now notice, what is it that God's thinking about you? Because it's one thing, like if God has all these thoughts running through his head, but if they're not all that great, notice David says how precious. He says how wonderful, how awesome. Just how incredible are the thoughts that God thinks about you and me. God is thinking about us all the time. And the thing that he's thinking about wonderful things concerning our lives. He's thinking about awesome things concerning our lives because he's got an incredible plan for our lives. He already drew it up. He's already got the blueprint and he's got it in store for our lives. All we've got to do is come in connection with it. All we've got to do is surrender to it. So think of it this way, because David says, man, the number of thoughts that you're thinking, God, it's about innumerable. There's so many. I don't know that I could even count them, but if I tried to count them, there would be more than the grains of sand on the earth. Now that is amazing, because the fact of the matter is God is thinking about you all the time. All the time he's thinking about you. And again, just as David pointed out, the thoughts that he has about you are wonderful, are awesome. It's kind of like back in school. Back in middle school, all right, some of you got to go a little bit further back. Back in middle school, when we were in middle school and maybe there was a girls that you were interested in, or there was a guy or there was a girl, boys that you were interested in, or maybe you just became boyfriend and girlfriend. And you're sitting in the classroom, maybe they're not in the same classroom as you. You remember this? When you had an interest in a guy or a girl and you just could not stop thinking about them. I mean, the thoughts are just going through your mind, and you're just like, oh my gosh, I wonder when our first kiss is going to be, and I mean, what's going to be our first date, and I can't wait to hold his hand or hold her hand. Oh, I want to write a nice little love note. Oh, Valentine's Day is coming up, and it's like 12 months away. Valentine's Day is coming up, and what am I going to get him or her? And we just have, I mean, you go back to middle school, and we just had this emotional love. It was puppy love, right? But the fact of the matter is we just kept thinking about that other person over and over and over. Or maybe you remember being back in school and you're just daydreaming, right? Your teacher's talking and you're just like, I mean, you've got this blank stare on your eye because in your mind you're just thinking, you're just daydreaming about the four-wheeler you're going to ride after school or about playing video games after school. That's all you're thinking about. It's like, man, I can't wait. Or maybe for us as adults, you know, even though we probably still play video games. I know I do. But maybe even for us as adults, we're at work and we're just daydreaming. Like maybe you sit in front of a computer all day like I do and you're just daydreaming and you're just like, and maybe you're just about to go on vacation. You're just thinking about your vacation just over and over. Man, I can't wait to go on vacation. I can't wait to go on that cruise. I'm going to eat so much and not care. I'm going to go to lunch. I'm going to go to lunch after lunch. I'm going to go to early dinner. I'm going to go to the right time of dinner. I'm going to go to the late night dinner because I don't care. I'm going to eat. I worry about exercise when I come back home, you know, and I get back to reality. But the fact of the matter is we just, I mean, there are things that we think about, whether they're people, whether it's work-related, whether it's our career, whatever it might be. We're thinking, and we think about things all the time. But here's the thing about that is we probably, and I guarantee you we don't. We do not think about any particular person or any particular thing as much as God thinks about us. Always on his mind. And even though there are a lot of things that are on our minds that we think a lot about, God is thinking about us all the time, over and over and over and over. And David says, you know what he's thinking? He's thinking stuff that is just precious, that is awesome, that's absolutely incredible, that you can't even imagine the things that God is thinking about you and I. See, because here's the thing about us. I mean, actually, we're more valuable. We hold more value to God, according to God, than the angels do. I mean, God has put upon us great value. There's great value. And here's the thing, friends, is that it's something to really think about because, you know, God didn't just out of the blue just say, okay, well, hey, I'm going to give that person life, or this woman wants a baby, so I'll give her a child, and yeah, I'll think about what, you know, I have planned for their life later on. You know, I'll do that later on. And here's the other thing is God seriously, he thought about your personal life, not just life, but he thought about your personal life. And in thinking about your personal life, God outlined it all. Just like when you look at a blueprint, you're seeing measurements, you're seeing length and width and height, and you're seeing where, I mean, it's so intricate. It's so intricate. And you look at our body. I don't know if you've ever looked at the body up closely and just watched videos and just how intricate. In fact, in Psalm 139, David says, God, I am fearfully and I'm wonderfully made. In other words, God, you didn't just say, oh, okay, you know, yeah, let me just make this man. Okay, I got to make a woman. Oh, another man. Okay, another one. God didn't, I mean, he took time. God said, no, I'm gonna take my time with this. I'm going to take my time with this. And here's the thing, friends, as I think about all the time that God took concerning our personal lives and how much we are on his mind. And then I think about how many times I've abused my life. How many times I've abused this personal life, this life that he's given me, this gift that he's given me. I think about my past and the many times where I walked away from God and I didn't want anything to do with him, or I wanted to do it my way. I wanted my plan instead of his plan. I think of all those times and I think, man, you know, here's God. He gave me this incredible gift of life and he's thinking about me all the time. And I went and I abused my life, or I abused the life that he's given me. Because the fact of the matter is, friends, your life holds value. It's valuable. I mean, it's important to God. In fact, Peter writes this in the New Testament. He says this in 1 Peter 2:9. He writes, however, you are a chosen people. That word chosen means favorite. Did you know you're God's favorite? I mean, now as parents, we can't do that with our children. I mean, we shouldn't. You know, we can't have one of our kids be our favorite because we can't handle that. Like we don't know how to properly do that. But God's perfect. And so God can say, yep, you're my favorite, 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 you're my favorite. Every person on the face of this earth is my favorite. God could do that and be perfect at it. Whereas as parents, you know, if we have a favorite, we're kind of entrusting and we're giving more to one of our children more than others. We like them more than others or whatever it might be. But God, or Peter's writing here, he says, you are a chosen people. God chose you. Now, this is interesting because go back to where Paul wrote that God chose us through Christ. And again, Peter says, hey, you're chosen, all right? The interesting thing about it is God didn't choose a particular race. God didn't choose a particular nation. God started with a nation. He started actually with a man, Abraham, to form a nation so that he can impact the entire world. God started with a nation, but it wasn't his grace and his mercy and his goodness and his plan for people's lives is not limited to the nation of Israel. It's for the entire world. And so the cool thing about it is God didn't say, no, this choice that I've made, me choosing, I've only chosen black people. I've only chosen Hispanic people. I've only chosen white people. I've only chosen whatever. No. See, God chose every person. God didn't just choose a nation. God chose every single person, and every person is his favorite. God looks at you, he looks at me, and he says, you're my favorite. You're my favorite. Peter goes on, he says, a royal priesthood. Did you know that God looks at you and he sees royalty? Now, I don't know about you, but if I'm royalty, man, where's my crown, Jack? Where's my crown? I'm looking for my crown because, I mean, and where's my robe and my throne and all of that? But the fact of the matter is God looks at us and he says, you're royalty. In other words, you're important. You're somebody that holds weight. See, friends, listen to me. You're not a nobody. I don't care who's told you that. I don't care if it's your parents that have told you that. I don't care if it's teachers when you were growing up. If teachers told you that you would amount to nothing, that you're a nobody. I don't care who told you that. You are not a nobody. God says you're somebody. And if there's somebody that knows, it's God. Because he's the one that created you. He's the one, again, that designed the blueprints to your life. And so the one that knows is God. And he's saying, no, you know what? You're somebody. You're somebody that's important to me. I don't care if you're not important to anybody else. God says, you're important to me. You carry weight. You've got value. He goes on, he says, people who are, or a holy nation. Did you know that you stand before God? Especially if you've accepted Jesus Christ as Savior and Lord of your life, because he's the sacrifice for our sin, that God looks at you and he says, you're holy? Now, I don't know about you, but I look at my life and I look at yesterday and it's like, holy God, you sure? I mean, I had this thought. Holy God, you sure? I mean, I said this. Holy God, you sure? Because I did this. There's a story in the Old Testament where there was this prophet by the name of Balaam, and a king comes to him because he didn't like the nation of Israel. And this king named Balak comes to Balaam and says, hey, I want you to pronounce a curse over the people of Israel. I want you to pronounce a curse over the nation of Israel, because all they're doing is they're just expanding and they're just growing and they're just multiplying, and they're gonna take over my nation. They're gonna take over this whole land. And so Balaam says, well, I'm just going to tell you, all I can say is what God tells me to say. So Balak's like, that's fine, but I just want you to curse them. I want you to curse the nation of Israel. So Balaam goes out there. He looks. They were on this high mountain, and they're looking down. And Balaam begins to speak, and he begins to pronounce blessings. God, you're blessing upon them. They're going to multiply, and they're going to do this, and they're going to do that. And Balak's like, no, what are you doing? I wanted you to curse them. I don't want them to multiply. And then Balaam, after a couple times, Balaam finally says, and speaking for God, or God speaking through him, Balaam finally says to Balak, I see no sin in Israel. Now, the fact of the matter is, when you look at the story and you look at the people of Israel at that time, you look at the nation of Israel at that time, there was everything but holiness. There was everything but goodness that was going on. They were fighting against Moses and fighting against God, and they wanted to go back to Egypt like we talked about the last few messages ago. They wanted to go back to Egypt and go be slaves again because everything that was going on wasn't working out the way that they thought. And they were just bad, okay? But God says, I don't see any sin. And it's the same thing for every single one of us that have accepted Jesus Christ as Savior and Lord of our life. God says, I don't see any sin in your life. That's why God says, I can pronounce you holy. Not because of anything you've done, not because of anything that I've done, but because of everything Jesus Christ has done on our behalf. That's why God can say, I pronounce you holy. I pronounce you spotless. You have no blemish. You have no mark on you, God says. So notice Peter's writing, and he's saying some pretty incredible things that God's thinking about us over and over and over. He says, however, you are chosen. You're God's favorite. You're royal. You're important. You're a holy nation, people who belong to God. You were chosen to tell about the excellent qualities of God. Now notice this. You were chosen to tell about the excellent qualities of God, talk about his character, his goodness, his miraculous work in our lives, who called you out of darkness into his marvelous light. Now that's interesting because, again, going back to, it takes a fool to say that there's no wickedness in our world. We could see that. We could see all the chaos. We could see that the world is messed up. We could see all the perversity and all the evil. And notice that God, he says, you were chosen to tell about his qualities, God who called you out of darkness into his marvelous light. In other words, existing in darkness is not only substandard living, but it's something God hates. Why does God hate it so much? Why does God hate darkness so much? Because it's substandard living. It's subpar. It's below you. It's below me. It's below every person on the face of this earth. To get trapped in evil and to give in to perversity and to give in to the destructive ways of life. The reason that God gives warnings, the reason that God says, hey, stay away from that, go turn away from that, it's not because God's trying to ruin our fun. It's not because God's trying to ruin our lives and make our lives a living hell. It's the fact that God cares about you too much. It's the fact that God values you too much. It's the fact that you are so important and that you're so valuable to God. It's the fact that he thinks about you over and over and over. It's the fact that he has an incredible plan for your life, and all this other stuff is only going to mess it up. All this other stuff is only going to cloud your judgment and cloud my judgment. All this other stuff is only going to ruin our lives. So that's the reason why God hates darkness so much. Think of it this way. Let's say we can make this room completely dark. It's just darkness. It's just pitch black. You can't see the nose in front of you. And let's say we just scattered everybody around, or actually, let's say we do this. Let's say we put everybody up against the wall in a line, right? And then we just turn out all the lights. And then we have somebody just add stuff all throughout the room. Even though there's already chairs, add stuff all throughout the room. And it is just pitch black. The chances of you running into somebody and into something are pretty great, aren't they? The chances of you hitting your knee, you ever done that? Like in the middle of the night? Boom! Oh! You did everything in your power not to cuss. You hit that thing with your knee, or you hit your funny bone, or you hit your shin. Shin's the worst. No, actually, your toes, man. You get that pinky, man. Just don't quit. That pain just don't quit. But it's like when it's pitch black, you're going to hurt yourself. When it's just complete darkness, and I'm just talking really, it's in a house or in a room somewhere. When it's complete darkness, you're probably going to run into something. You're probably going to run into someone. You're probably not only going to hurt yourself, if there's other people in the house or in the room, you're probably going to hurt somebody else. And it's the same as it relates to the darkness in this world, friends. Is the darkness is designed to hurt our lives. That if we get involved in the darkness that God is trying to keep us from, that God's warning us about, if we get involved in the darkness, we're only going to hit our knee. We're only going to hit our shin. We're going to stub our toe. We're going to hurt ourselves. And the chances of us hurting, running into somebody else and hurting their life too are great because it's darkness. And that's what darkness does. Darkness hurts our life. So God's not against the fun. God's not against the good times. But God will warn. Why? Because it's substandard. A life of darkness is a substandard life. And God says, I got so much better in store for you. I got so much of a better, more incredible life in store for you if you'll trust me, if you'll trust the blueprints that I've laid out, that I've designed, that I've drawn up for your life. Let's go back to Jeremiah. Jeremiah 29:11. Something else I want to point out. Notice this. He says, I know the plans. I know the blueprint. I drew it up, God says. I know the plans that I have for you, declares the Lord. They are plans. They're the blueprints for peace and not disaster. Plans to give you a future filled with hope. Now let me ask you a question. Does the future look grim to you? Does it seem like your life is just turned upside down? And it's just staying there? Does it feel like you have everything but hope? Like you're just totally hopeless? You just don't see any way out of your situation? You don't see any way out of your circumstance? You look at your situation and you're just like, man, it's been like this for a year. I don't see it ever changing. It's been like this for years. It's been like this for months. I don't ever see it changing. I've lost hope. I've lost hope that this will ever change in my life. I've lost hope that my marriage can be restored. I've lost hope that I could ever have a relationship with my children again. I've lost hope that I could ever have the career that I've always wanted. I've lost hope. I've lost hope. I've lost hope. I believe what the doctors are saying. I'm going to die by this disease. I've lost hope. It doesn't look like it's changing. In fact, instead of getting better, I'm getting worse. I've lost hope. I lost hope. Let me ask you something. Is there nothing but chaos going on in your life right now? Because here's the thing. God did not draw up chaos, unrest, hopelessness to your blueprints or for your blueprints. God didn't draw that up in your life blueprints. He didn't draw up chaos. He didn't draw up hopelessness. He didn't draw up unrest. And so here's the thing. We've got to be honest with ourselves. And if there's some unrest going on, if there's some hopelessness, if there's some chaos, if there's some destruction going on in our lives, the first thing that we've got to look at is we've got to look at our lives. We got to look at ourselves. We got to be honest with ourselves. And is there anything that we're contributing to the life that we have? Because again, going back to darkness, God is warning about darkness. God hates darkness. God wants to keep us out of darkness. Why? Because it's destructive to our life. We're going to hurt ourselves and we're going to hurt people around us. And so we have to be honest. If there's constant chaos going on in our life, if God didn't draw it up, then who did? Then who did? And here's the thing. We can't even blame Satan, all right? We can't even blame the devil. We can't even say, well, the devil is attacking me. The devil's doing this. The devil's doing that. We can't blame him unless we've given our lives over to him in the sense that we haven't surrendered our lives or we've walked away from God. And even though we don't bow down or worship the devil, we've just basically made the choice to live in his way, live his way, because that's his plan, is darkness for our lives. That's what he desires for our lives, is darkness. But we have to be absolutely honest with ourselves. And if we're seeing this constant chaos or this constant destruction going on in our lives, or we're seeing this constant negative effects in our lives, we have to be honest. Are we contributing to our life? Are we contributing something that is bringing that result to our lives? Have we walked away from God? Have we rejected his plan, his blueprint for our life? Instead of saying God's plan, have we said, I plan? I'm going to talk a little bit more about that next week. Or have we accepted somebody else's plan for our life? See, because just like I can come up with my own plan, I can also adopt somebody else's plan. Let me ask us something. Have we adopted somebody's plan for our life? Have you just taken somebody else's plan? Or maybe you've just copied somebody else's plan. Like, you know how you go into a model home and you want to buy the model that the builders that they're building, you know, and you just see these cookie cutters, especially in your gated communities. You see like the same home one after another. And you know, if you go and buy the model, then when they build your house, it's going to look just like the model. And it's the same thing for our lives. Have we copied somebody else's life? Have we taken somebody else's blueprint or somebody's model and just said, oh yeah, I'm just going to take that for my life? And then we have to be honest. Is it destroying our lives? Is it harmful to our lives? Now I know, and I know that, okay, aside from that, I also know we live in a messed up world. And I know that we go through situations and circumstances in our life, okay? I get that. But here's the point, is that whether it's chaos that we've created for ourselves, or whether it's a situation going on in just because it's life, okay? Here's the thing. God didn't draw up the chaos. God didn't draw up the unrest or the hopelessness. Now, if it's something that we created for ourselves, we can get away from that simply by receiving his plan for our life. Now, if it's something that's just because it's life, God will bring us through it. God will cause us to come through it. And so it's not something that we have to lose hope and say, oh my gosh, you know, my world is turned upside down. I know that happens. I know that death happens, you know, and we lose a loved one, and we lose friends, and we lose family. We lose our jobs from time to time. And those things happen just because it's life. That's just a fact. That's just a reality of life. But it doesn't mean that God drew up hopelessness or unrest or chaos or something harmful for your life or for my life. What it just means is it's life, and let's watch, just as we talked about a couple messages back, let's watch and see the salvation of God in our lives, because he will bring us through it. All things, Paul wrote, Romans 8:29, all things will work together for good to those who love him and who are called according to his purpose. Notice this, David continues on when he's talking about the amazing thoughts. He says in verse 16 of Psalm 139, every day of my life was recorded in your book. Blueprint, every day. God drew it up. He outlined it. He measured it out. Put it all together. Every day of my life was recorded in your book before one of them had taken place. And God has greatness in mind for you and me. Not unrest, not hopelessness, not chaos, not destruction. God has greatness in mind for us. Paul writes, going along this train of thought, Paul writes in Ephesians 2:10, he says, God has made us what we are. He has created us in Christ Jesus. Again, going back to Christ, that God had a plan to save us. He has created us in Christ Jesus to live lives filled with good works that he has prepared for us to do. So God has this good life in store. And here's the thing. Again, God has the good life in store for us. Or I would say it this way. And again, notice that Paul writes, he says, to live lives filled with good works that he prepared for us to do. Notice the construction terms. God made, God created, God prepared. God made, God created, God prepared. Blueprint. God put it all together, and it's something good. And he wants your life to be good, and he wants you to produce good works that he's prepared, that he built, that he constructed for you and I to do. In other words, a life that is full of good deeds leads to living the good life. I mean, you and I can live the good life. And I'm not talking about sitting on the beach sipping margaritas, although that's not out of the question. But I'm not talking necessarily about that being the good life, although that's not out of the question. But I'm talking about the good life that God has in store for us. In other words, look at it this way: following the architect's blueprint for your life, that is the life. Nobody else, nothing else, not even me, as far as for my own life and you for your own life, nobody else, nothing else can construct, orchestrate, create the life that God has created for us, the life that he has drawn up for you and I. It's perfect. It's awesome. It's beautiful. And all we have to do is say, okay, God, I want your blueprint for my life. All we have to do is receive it. All we have to do is accept it for our lives. Now, for you, that may be, well, I mean, how do I even do that? I don't even know this God. I don't even know this Jesus that you're talking about. And that would be your next step. That would be your first step, is to surrender your life to the architect. It's just like our own place, for example, the church's facility. We have to surrender to the codes. We have to surrender to the architects, and we have to just surrender to the county. And they're going to tell us what we're going to be able to do and what we can't do. And we've got to surrender to that. There's nothing that we're going to be able to do. But the other thing, too, is they have our best interest. They're trying to protect people. The reason why they have the codes and the reason why they say you can and you can't is because they're protecting people. And it's the same thing with God. God says, hey, I've got it. I've got it all laid out. I've got a great plan for your life. But you got to submit to it. But know this, God says, I've got your best interest in mind. I think about you all the time, over and over and over. And you know what I'm thinking about you? Man, that's an awesome son I got there. My daughter, she is so beautiful. My God, I just see greatness in my son there. I see greatness in my daughter. Man, I can't wait to accomplish this in their life. I can't wait to do this in their life. Why? Because that's who God is. He loves us too much to just let us live a subpar life, substandard, below ourselves life. He's got a great life for you and I. So the question is this: whose blueprint am I using to build my life? Whose blueprint am I going to use to build my life? And like I said, for you, that may be, hey, I need to give my life to God. First time, surrender my life to him. Or for you, that may be to resurrender your life. Maybe you've walked away and you said, nah, instead of God's plan, my plan, or somebody else's plan. You've got to be honest about whatever plan. I've got to be honest about whatever plan we've chosen for our life, what blueprint that we're following, what outline, what plan of action that we're following. And is it bringing the results that we desire for our life? And we'll talk more about that next week as far as the other plans that are out there that are also available. Let's close up in a word of prayer. God, I thank you so much today for this message, for this word that you've given us, that you've spoken to us today. And God, I just pray that we would allow this message, that we would allow your word to land on the launching pad of our lives, wherever it needs to land in our lives. And God, that we would just be willing to accept what you desire for our lives, and that you would help us to put your plan of action, the blueprints that you drew up, to put that into action in our lives, to put that into practice in our lives, to live that out, God. In Jesus' name we pray.